Good evening. I think we'll get started. My name is Stephanie Stobie, and I am a professor in conflict resolution studies here at Menno Simons College, a college of Canadian Mennonite University affiliated with the University of Winnipeg. On behalf of the Visiting ESOL Committee, I would like to thank you for coming tonight and to welcome and thank Dr. J. Rothman for being here with us. The Visiting ESOL Fund was donated by Paul and Esther Esau for the purposes of attracting scholars in the fields of conflict resolution studies and international development studies, bringing their experience and to interact with our faculty and students. Dr. J. Rothman joins us tonight to speak on creating peace from the inside out, bringing his knowledge and expertise of identity-based conflict and conflict engagement in various places around the world, including the Middle East. Before I formally introduce Dr. J. Rothman and invite him to speak with us, I would like to give opportunity for welcome from a few of our partners in peace building from various institutions. First, please welcome Dr. Pauls, President of Canadian Mennonite University, who will say a few words of welcome.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to be present for this lecture and time of conversation, and it's a delight to meet Dr. Rothman and to share this evening with all of you. You know, the older I get, the more inclined I am to root myself and ourselves in place and time. The place tonight is through the program of Menno Simons College. MSC, as we call Menno Simons College, is a college of Canadian Mennonite University, a university that sustains the mandate of this college and its faculty. Menno Simons College is affiliated with University of Winnipeg, and MSC's programs in conflict resolution studies and international development studies are fully integrated within the University of Winnipeg. The U of W shares with CMU a strong commitment to educating for peace and justice, and to living out this commitment in its programs, its partnerships, and its operations. Time, what we might call the times. We might say we're saddened as we see misunderstanding upon misunderstanding mar the Earth's skin, even as new forms of a thriving diversity and reconciling friendships are ever emerging. This is a time as we in the north approach summer solstice, and here in Winnipeg, we linger in the length of the days and are reminded of extreme brevity in the days in the real south. In the combination of these times and these places, we live with an increasing awareness that everyone in every time and place lives in different conditions. And everyone has an accent, a culture, an identity, and a means of practicing virtue. All these things are fluid, but they never wash away. And there's no such thing as an overriding neutral zone within which values can be assigned or practiced. It is in the midst of these places and times that I am heartened by this evening's conversation. Menno Simons College, along with CMU as a whole, flows in and out of people who in one form or another over the centuries have aspired to say, there may be a list of this and that over which we'd be ready to die, but we're not prepared to kill for any of them. This school also flows within people for whom the love of God, of learning, of the land, and indeed all of life's dimensions are incomprehensible in isolation and cherished within all sorts of interdependent webs. And so through both Menno Simons College and Shaftesbury campuses of CMU, we go about both conflict resolution studies and peace and conflict transformation studies in a time and place that fosters the interconnectedness of scholarly rigor, faithfulness, relationships of trust, and a generous imagination. Thanks for sharing your voice and your ears in the beauty and hope of this maze.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Neil Besner, Provost and Vice President, Academic and International. The title's too long. On behalf of Dr. Axworthy, the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Winnipeg and of UWinnipeg's Global College and Menno Simons College, I would like to welcome you to the University of Winnipeg on ESOL Lecture. With constant change and injustice in the world, peacemaking from the inside out is an essential reality. with governments spying on their citizens, civil war in Syria, the civil unrest in Turkey, the idea of improving our society from the inside out is an important realization. And the University of Winnipeg strives to create global citizens that will affect change in our communities and improve our societies. So we are honored to be able to welcome Dr. Jay Rothman, a recent professor, in fact, from Bar Ilan University, Israel, to our campus. His experience as a mediator and consultant to national leaders in the Middle East is significant. This evening's topic and speaker reflects the spirit of justice and social change through mediation and consultation, an important reality. Winnipeg, like CMU, like Menno Simons, prides itself on our work in research and conflict resolution and in human rights. So just this past Wednesday, the University of Winnipeg's Global College and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights presented a panel discussion on the groundbreaking genocide trial of former Guatemalan dictator José Efraín Ríos Montt. The speakers included Julio Sorozano Fopa, son of Guatemala's first democratically elected president and leading human rights defender, and Pascal Paradis, founder of Lawyers Without Borders Canada, just back from the trial. This past May, the University of Winnipeg awarded honorary doctorates to two renowned champions of human rights in a special convocation. Lieutenant General the Honorable Romeo Dallaire, Honorable Doctorate of Sacred Letters, and Father Patrick Desbois, Honorary Doctorate of Divinity. Lieutenant General the Honorable Dallaire, as many of us know, has witnessed and tried to prevent the unspeakable, the massacre of 800,000 people in Rwanda. As Force Commander of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Rwanda in 1994, he refused orders to leave the country and remained to protect those trying to escape the genocide. It was a mission that left Dallaire with deep emotional scars and a determination to advance global human rights, most notably ending the recruitment and use of child soldiers around the world. The distinguished Father Desbois, renowned for his work in the areas of conflict resolution, reconciliation, and restorative dialogue, has devoted his whole life to confronting anti-Semitism and has earned international respect as a humanitarian. And Winnipeg itself, where we all are, I agree with you, Dr. Pauls, it's a time and a place, a local time and place. Winnipeg has a growing reputation as a center that nurtures global citizens and is striving to become a human rights city, and your attendance this evening is an example of that. I'm struck by how many people gave up sunshine for a lecture. Good for you. At the University of Winnipeg, as educators, we consider it our primary responsibility to foster global citizenship. It matters how we treat this planet and each other, and all of our interdisciplinary programs are designed to create well-rounded, socially conscious global citizens. Through our Global College, we offer a Bachelor of Arts degree in Human Rights and Global Studies. It's a unique program in Western Canada, along with a Joint Masters in Peace and Conflict Studies, which means that young people who want to make a difference in the world in areas of international human rights, humanitarian and refugee work, or international aid have a place to get a relevant education here at home. So Dr. Rothman, again, welcome to our campus. Thank you.
I'm delighted, and I know that word has been used once before today already, but it's the one word that keeps coming to my mind, just the delight of being able to welcome Dr. Rothman and also welcome all of you who are here to hear him speak. The work and the writing of Dr. Rothman have been a major influence on the teaching and the work done here at Menno Simons for pretty well the entire time that I've been here. His book on resolving identity conflict has been used in several of the classes here, and concepts and ideas and challenges have certainly percolated through in a lot of the interaction with students and a lot of the thinking about the kind of research and the kind of work that we need to do. So now, after several years of trying to make arrangements to get Dr. Rothman here, I'm just delighted that we can finally bring him here to this campus as the MSc visiting professor, ESOL visiting professor for the spring of 2013. Through the persistence and the diligent hard work of Dr. Stephanie Stobie and colleagues, and certainly many of us here have learned that how difficult it is to say no to Dr. Stobie when she really is persistent and wants to get something done. But through this persistence and diligence, We've just really excited about being able to welcome you here tonight and also for the next 2 weeks. Menno Simons College, as most of you know, operates as a downtown campus for Canadian Mennonite University and also a college affiliated with the University of Winnipeg, offering 3-year and 4-year majors in conflict resolution studies and international development studies, as well as a 4-year honors major in international development studies toward the University of Winnipeg BA credit, as well as participating in the joint masters, as was referred to earlier, peace and conflict studies. Through the provisions of an endowment left by Paul Esau, a supporter of Menno Simons College from the beginning, we've enjoyed the privilege of regularly welcoming a distinguished scholar and/or practitioner in either conflict resolution studies or international development studies, or both, to bring some added depth to our teaching and research and to provide faculty and students an opportunity for an extended period of time, which may be a couple of weeks, as in this case, or perhaps up to a full semester, to interact with and to be enriched by someone who we otherwise would only be able to encounter through their writings or occasional conference lecture. So Dr. J. Rothman joins us here today as the next inheritor of this mantle, as someone that we feel deeply honored to welcome here in our midst as the Esau Visiting Professor for the summer of 2013. This event tonight marks only the beginning of the time that Dr. Rothman will spend with us. Over the next 2 days, he will facilitate a 2-day skills workshop, and next week, a 5-day intensive course where he will expand further on the stories, concepts, and challenges to be introduced tonight. So again, we're just happy and pleased and delighted to welcome Dr. Rothman here.
Dr. Rothman has been an academic and practitioner in the field of conflict resolution for the past 25 years. In the course of his career, he has worked with diplomats, business executives, opposing leaders, union leaders, school boards, community activists, and students around the world. He is a teacher, trainer, and student of the arts and science of conflict engagement, and has developed and taught cutting-edge methodologies for conflict engagement and collective visioning. Dr. Rothman has lectured and taught in many countries around the world, including Haverford College, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Antioch University, University of Denver, and University of Cincinnati. As mentioned earlier, in 2012, Dr. Rothman was appointed associate professor and holds a chair in the graduate program on conflict resolution and negotiation at Bar Ilan University in Israel. He is a co-editor of the International Journal of Conflict, Engagement, and Resolution, and author and editor of 4 books, including Resolving Identity-Based Conflict in Nations, Organizations, and Communities, and From Identity-Based Conflict to Identity-Based Cooperation. He has published extensively on identity-based conflict, conflict resolution, and evaluation. He has facilitated and mediated internationally for several decades, led workshops, and given keynote presentations at numerous conferences and convocations in more than a dozen countries. We have a few Antioch University connections here tonight. Dr. Hamdessa Tussaud, who is our respondent to tonight's talk, was a colleague of Dr. Rothman, and I've had the privilege of having Dr. Rothman as my master's thesis advisor and working on the action evaluation research team. Dr. Rothman has brought his creative and practical approaches to countries and communities around the world, including Cyprus, Israel, Northern Ireland, and the former Soviet Union and Sri Lanka. In 2006, he provided policy advice to the Israeli Minister's Office on Minority Affairs, and in 2006-2007, he was a Fulbright senior researcher and scholar in Israel. Please welcome Dr. Rothman as he shares his journey as peace seeker, theorist, trainer, and mediator in identity-based conflicts around the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming this evening, indeed for giving up this beautiful evening. I'm really enjoying your sunshine. It's a great delight. Thank you, President Cheryl Pauls, for your welcome and your inspiration about educating for peace and understanding. Not so many presidents of universities that I know use that as a major hook and anchor of the purpose of the university, so I'm honored to be here in your presence. And thank you, Provost Neil Bresner, for your notion about building global citizens. I realize the notion of global citizenship is so central to how we're going to make it into the coming years. On the one hand, being rooted in the place and the time that we are, and on the other hand, being able to connect beyond our own boundaries. Acting Dean Neil Funk, thank you so much for your enthusiasm and your welcome to me here. I'm really honored. And then, of course, my student, my star student, actually, Stephanie Stobie, for the persistence of getting me here. I'm so delighted to be here with you. And Hamdasa Tuso, for your colleagueship over these many years. It's great to be here with you again. So imagine with me, if you would, if everybody could take everyone else's perspective, how they see life, how they see their experiences, what they understand. If all of us could basically see the way other people see, not necessarily agree, but see their perspectives, how different our world would be. Of course, agreeing with each other about everything, always, is neither possible nor actually ideal. But being able to deeply understand what people think about, what they feel, what they believe, and why. And why. That's the root of a world without war. However, agreeing with each other about everything, always, is neither possible nor is it the root of peace. What is learning to live and respect the differences that each other has between themselves as individuals, as groups, as nations, as societies. The German social philosopher Theodor Adorno said a successful work of art, and for me actually conflict resolution is like a successful work of art. A successful work of art is not one which resolves contradictions in a spurious harmony, but one which expresses the idea of harmony negatively by embodying the contradictions, pure and uncompromised, in its innermost structure. My expertise in group-based cooperation at home and abroad, which mines the passions of dissonance, of difference, of diversity, and promotes the resonance in identities, priorities, goals, and styles, is a resource, conflict as a resource, disagreement as a resource for dynamism, for learning, and for excellence. I root my work in musical metaphors, producing an aria, engaging in solos, promoting duets, conducting interventions, moving from dissonance as a creative source of energy into resonance, and so forth. But away from my models for a minute, and let's go back to this dream of a world in which everybody can take the perspective of each other and live with the differences deeply. As I was completing my most recent book, From Identity-Based Conflict to Identity-Based Cooperation, a very close friend and a social theorist who works on decision-making theory, Gary Klein, told me about a family tradition of his. And the family tradition is when they sat around the dinner table and they had dialogue, they had debate. Whenever the debate and dialogue got too intense, any of the listeners could call out, "Switch," and then the two sides would have to take the other side's perspective. Imagine that. Try that at your dinner table. And that person who said switch would keep them in their role until they were satisfied that each of the daughters or the parents and the daughters could indeed take the other side's perspective. So many people ask me, and I imagine you might as well, how did I get into this business? Part of my job and my work is to listen to questions and to respond to questions at the level at which they're asked. So when people ask me in a general way, how did you get into this field? I give them a general answer. And the general answer is, I saw a little article, a little advertisement in the New York Times in 1981, advertising the first program in conflict resolution in the world. It was at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And I thought it would be interesting, so I applied and I got in. And so thus I began my career in conflict resolution. If it turns out that they want to know more, if they're really asking me more genuine questions, I may go back and say, I'd been a social activist. My commitment in life was for justice, was for social change, was for cooperation, inclusion, but I was getting weary of the fight. I was getting weary of being more part of the diatribe of us versus them. And this notion of conflict resolution was appealing to me. If they still probe and say, yeah, but what made you a social activist? What led you to be focusing on this for your life? I'd go back to talking about when I was 17 years old. And I traveled around the world and I was getting weary wandering, and I made my way to Israel, pretty much by accident. I had a friend who I'd known when I was a youth, and I went to visit him. It was pretty much by accident because it was just another country for me. But as I got there, I discovered it wasn't just another country for me. It actually was my heritage. I'd grown up a very assimilated American, my parents having decided that our Jewish ancestry wasn't very important to us. But as I got to Israel, I discovered that it was very important to me. And this created a real contradiction in my own understanding of myself and my world. Up until this point, my sense was the world should be one, and that differences were a problem, and that our ideal was to bridge them. And now I was discovering that my identity and my people's identity was meaningful and valuable, and I wanted to be part of it. But also I noticed that this being part of one group often led to being against another group. And so this contradiction was very confusing for me. And if they probe even further and said, yeah, but what led to all this? What led you finally to decide at age 23 to enter that first program in conflict resolution? I tell them it all began in second grade. When I was preparing this book, I interviewed my second grade teacher. And I said, I'm trying to figure out why I'm in this business. People keep asking me. Do you have any memory of anything that might suggest an inclination towards this strange career of being in the middle, of always being able to take perspective of everybody, and sometimes even having to give up my own perspective for a while? She said to me, yes, I do have a memory of such an experience. And she told me a story that became an organizing story for me. And I'll share that with you since I assume that you really deeply want to know why I got into this business. She said, I came running in from the playground. And I said, Miss Price, there's a fight on the playground and people are being unfair to each other. You need to do something about it. And she said, one of the things I learned as an elementary school teacher was that when no one was breathing, I would. So I took a deep breath and I said to you, so Jay, what do you think you should do about it? Me? Yeah, what do you think you should do about it? I don't know. That's why I told you have to do something. She said, no, what do you think you should do? And I said, well, I guess we should ring the bell. We had a tradition that when there was a problem and the bell was rung, everyone would come in and circle up, no matter how bad the problem. So I rang the bell. That was really fun. And they all came in and sat around in a circle. And I sat next to Bev. And Bev looked down at me. And I looked up at her. And I said, now what? And she said, you know. And I said, no, I don't. And she said, yes, you do. And I said, well, I guess we should talk about it. She said, good idea. And she says that I led a really successful meeting. For me, the core set of values in this work, the reason that I am in it, is for this notion of participation and agency. She taught me those things. That I was a participant, not an observer, and that I had agency to do something about it. That's the taproot of my work. That's the taproot to some extent, for me anyway, of this field. That we're able to promote and advocate that everyone has a voice and everyone is able to be, to a lesser or greater extent, and our job, of course, is to make it more and more, an agent in articulating and determining the future that we're going to be able to live in. So back to this experience as a 17-year-old, discovering these conflicts and these deep resonances in myself, between myself as a universalist and myself as now a particularist, between my people, the Jewish people, and its neighbors, the Palestinian people, between all groups who are rivals of each other when ultimately, for their own self-preservation, they need to become allies. What could be done about this? So I entered into this new program, and I discovered a methodology which is called an international conflict resolution, particular approach of it called the International Problem-Solving Workshop, developed by John Burton and Edward Azar and Herbert Kellman, folks here in America and in England, in the United States and in England, who had been, John Burton in particular, had been a fairly mainstream diplomat. He served in what was then Ceylon, as it became Sri Lanka, and he became quite disenchanted with the normal approach of international relation of power politics. The notion that states are hard shells bouncing off against each other, but rather instead that states are simply containers, and they're containers of groups and organizations, and groups and organizations are containers of individuals, and within individuals are irrepressible, irreducible needs. Needs for justice, needs for meaning, needs for control, needs for identity, needs for safety, needs for well-being. That these, said John Burton and his colleagues, are the basic building blocks of all international relations. And when these are threatened and frustrated, conflict breaks out. And the deeper the conflicts and the more threat and the more frustration, the more violent and the more aggressive are these conflicts. It was a very compelling notion. It was an alternative notion to how state politics, statecraft should work. So I took this notion and I tried to figure out how to transfer it back to the experience of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How do we take this notion of nation states and ultimately the needs of individuals, here expressed in terms of identity-based groups, how do we take this and turn it into something constructive? And as we're going to build a field, and this was really the early days of our field, it's really not too much more than 30, 40 years old, this field of ours, the field of conflict resolution. If we're going to promote a particular methodology, we have to evaluate it, and we have to be able to replicate it. So what I was able to do was go back to Israel now, this time as a pre-doctoral fellow. I had an appointment as a junior fellow at the Hebrew University, and I did a series of experiments with the undergraduates. That's where we do so many of our experiments in life. These were a very interesting group of undergraduates. They were Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians. And they came with me to weekend retreats, where I would adapt this methodology of the problem-solving workshop that was really designed for politicians, and working on it at the level of youth leadership. As often happens with beginnings, the first such workshop was perhaps the most powerful of all. And the first experience of that first workshop really organized so much of what came to follow. As we gathered in a place called Tantur, which is on the outskirts of Jerusalem, actually owned by the Vatican, a true neutral ground. We were waiting for our last participant, Mohammed. And we had an equal number of Jews and an equal number of Palestinians, all Israelis. But we couldn't start before Mohammed arrived because it wouldn't be equal. So finally he arrives, out of breath, and says to us with great distress, I got to the gates of this institution and I just about turned back. I was so discouraged. I said, what happened? We haven't even started. Why are you so discouraged? He said, I was riding on the bus to get here, and next to me was a young Israeli Jewish girl, and I saw her looking at me, and then I saw her looking at the sign on the bus. And back then, there were signs on buses that said, Chefetz Chashud, Tizacher, which is, suspicious, be aware of suspicious objects. Suspicious objects then were bombs. And she looked at the sign, and then she looked at me, and then she looked at the sign, and then she looked at me, and her eyes got wider, and she jumped up, and she ran to the other side of the bus, and she said, Arab, Arab. And I said to myself, if a 6-year-old girl already sees me as a suspicious object and is terrified of me, what's the point of coming to this workshop, to dialogue? It's too late. It's too late. It doesn't make any sense to be here. Efrat, one of the Jewish Israeli counterparts, said to Mohammed, I'm sorry you had such a bad experience, but your story doesn't make any sense. That's exactly why we're here. Of course our people mistrust each other and fear each other. They haven't been able to encounter each other in the kinds of ways that hopefully we are going to hear. And he shook his head and said, you don't understand. And she said, you're right, and I don't really want to. That despair is self-fulfilling. So that's how we began the workshop. It was very dark. It was very discouraging. And the way we begin our workshops, actually, is we go into our disagreements. We don't look for common ground. We bring out those things that lead to the contrasts, that lead to the hurts. And indeed, Mohammed's story was a perfect, if tragic, example. And we spend the day raising the blame that each has of the other. It's a bit counterintuitive. Many folks think that the first way to start a peace process is to find the common ground and build the bridges, but we do it differently. And I learned really in working in the Middle East that if you don't go back, there's no way to go forward. You can't wall off that hurt and hope for hope. You have to talk about it. You have to enter into it. At some point, you have to say, how are we doing? And people say, not very well. And then you have to say, you want to do something different? And usually they say, please. Why are you making us do this? Why are you making us surface and raise all these hurtful, even hateful attitudes? We say to them, we're not making you do anything. We're inviting you to live here in this artistic moment, sort of an intensification of reality, as you've been living with each other for weeks, years, decades, even longer. We just opened up the door and you walked through it. But if you want to do something different, we'd like to do that. So when you come back tomorrow morning, get ready for something different. Well, experiences and circumstances often get in the way of best plans. And the next morning, we arrived back in the workshop. This was a very protected environment. It's outside of Jerusalem. It's a beautiful environment. It feels like an oasis. But as we walked into the room, we saw on the board, on the blackboard, not this beautiful tree, but rather what we saw was written on the wall, Jews out of Palestine. If you do not leave, we will kill you. And that's how we started the workshop the next morning. And Ahmed and I, who were co-facilitating, tried to make light of it. You wrote that. No, you wrote that. It wasn't very funny. We called in the director, actually a famous peacemaker. His name is Landrum Bowling. He was then the director. He was dumbfounded. He didn't know how that could have happened. And then Efrat, the same girl who yesterday had said to Mohammed, I don't understand you, stood up and said, I can't stay here. It's too unsafe. It's too scary to be here. And Mohammed looked at her and said to her, Efrat, please don't leave. We really need you to be here. And so she stayed. And then we changed the workshop from the antagonism that came from the past into the hope and what we call the resonance for living with each other as we build a different future. And the basic resonance, the basic point of switch, right? Like my friend at his dinner table. The basic point of switch is when each is able to ask of the other, why do you care so much? It's a simple question. It's a very difficult question. Why does this matter to you so deeply? Some years ago, I saw on a church bulletin, when you point your finger at the other, notice where the other 3 fingers are pointing back. And that's really the whole thing on one foot. We point to the other and say, this is what you've done. This is why you're to blame. Instead, we say, this is what matters so deeply to me. This is who I am, and these are the things that impact my life. Then everything begins to change, and a new norm begins to be established. The new norm in which we then can begin to imagine and invent a different future in which each side's story has a place, and each side's aspirations are worked for in a collaborative instead of competitive way. That these basic underlying needs and the narratives that are told are what organizes and sets the agenda for the future. And indeed, as we wrapped up this workshop, one of the things that we do to get ready for action planning, what are we going to do with these new insights? That each side has a story, and the story contains aspirations that need to be fulfilled. We ask each side to take the role of the other side and say, a Palestinian now saying, as a Jew, this is what's important to me. And the Jew saying, as a Palestinian, this is why I care so much. Mohammed did his reversal, and he said, as an Israeli Jew, this is what the past is like for me that's so painful. This is the future would be like that's so hopeful. Here's how I want to live. And when he finished, the Jews stood up and they applauded him. And they said, Mohammed, would you be our ambassador to the United Nations? So the switch was made there. And it created really a resonance for me upon which all of my career has been built. So we go from the notion of needs and of nations to the narratives of communities, transfer this large political notion to the smaller group identities, evaluate it in ways that seems indeed that we're able to help people make the switch. And we did the statistical analysis of pre-test and post-test and showed that indeed these participants were better problem solvers after they went through the experience. But this living with ghosts, the hurts, the fears, the antagonism, these are the things that deep conflicts are built on. And as I said before, we can't jump over them and hope to build bridges and common ground without walking through them. It's what I learned so deeply from working in the Middle East, from working in ethnic conflict around the world, that the notion of walling off the past and hoping for a better future ends up being very counterproductive. It's actually an argument I have with the field. You heard perhaps Stephanie talking about the word conflict engagement. I think our term conflict resolution, at least in these very most deepest of conflicts, is probably unrealistic. We're not going to resolve the hatred, the killing, the fear, and the hurt that has happened between these groups. But we can engage the conflicts in ways that the difficulties and the dissonance can be transformed to some extent anyway into possibility and imagination. So when we ask people to frame their antagonism towards each other, it's only a beginning. It's a beginning for them then to say, here's my narrative, here's my story. And a story is basically a way to help us organize in the present what has happened to us, what things are most present for us in our lives as we think about the conflict situation we're in with the other. Why this is so deeply important to us, again, what I was saying, that one of the real gifts of conflict, in an ironic way perhaps, is the more we engage it and the more we help other people engage their conflicts, the more we're able to help them understand what's most important to them. Right? The extent to which they blame the other and they see other as the fault and the problem of all things, they're really avoiding what's waiting to be discovered through the gift even of conflict. After all, my needs and my values are very similar ultimately to yours. They often have to do with our children. They often have to do with a hope for the future. They often have to do with getting out of living in this constant cycle of despair and fear and moving into some place of possibility. Okay, so moving up the tree. So if the taproot of this work of mine, I think of our field as participation and agency, and the particular trunk that I worked in has been this field of international conflict resolution. And then my particular branch of that has been to bring it into the level of groups and intergroup relations. And perhaps a paradoxical contribution of mine is that we have to deal with the ghosts, we have to raise the antagonisms, we have to walk through the difficulty and the tragedy of the past. Given that my own passion is for creativity and music and imagination, it's a little bit of an ironic twist of fate that I'm known as the antagonistic guy, that my work is about bringing up these very deep and often buried wounds and making them explicit, making them clear. But moving then from needs and now focusing instead on these sort of a canon of needs that Burton and his colleagues discovered and described, that all peoples need these needs, I found that to be a little bit culturally abstract, to some extent even rejecting the specificity and the difference of culture. And what I found to be even more useful than saying all peoples have these needs is that all peoples have narratives. And each narrative is unique. Each narrative comes from its own context, although in the narrative there also is always to be found common threads and a weaving and emerging and even a meshing of the most important things that all people say, from whatever society, east, west, north, or south. So after my dissertation, I stayed in Jerusalem, actually was given large grants. Those grants were both a boon and a bane to my career, because I then became an organizer, an administrator, an activist. I didn't publish. I didn't do the things that I needed to do to rise up the ranks. Instead, I administered programs. And what was wonderful about that is I got to transform theory into practice and keep trying to improve the theory so practice would be more effective, and then indeed try to mine the practice to see if we could build more robust theory. So from needs to narratives to practices, big enough to matter and small enough to work. In Jerusalem, I helped to set up the first program in Israel, the Project on Conflict Resolution at the Hebrew University. This was in 1989. And that project had 3 programs that each went for a couple years. The first one is the program on pre-negotiation. And we taught diplomats who were serving in Israel, diplomats from all over the world, Egyptians, Spanish, Germans, French, Israelis, Africans from different countries in Africa. It was a fascinating group, about 20 diplomats. And we trained them in this notion of pre-negotiation, and we trained them in this notion of needs and values and narratives. Once a week for 10 weeks. It was a great experience. It was also a rather disheartening experience. At the end of it, we said to the diplomats, these were mostly second, some first secretaries, many on their way to being ambassadors, how was this for you? How will this impact your work? They said it was wonderful, it was fascinating, and also a little discouraging because we're not able to talk about these things. This is not what we do in diplomacy. We talk about the things that you said is rejected. Hard power politics between nations and how to protect and promote our interests. 30 years later, I just went to a talk of an Israeli diplomat just a couple weeks ago. And he said what we've learned in doing our diplomacy is that it's not so much the power politics between states, but it's the organizations and the groups and the communities that help us structure and restructure our relationships. These are the things that diplomats are now focused on. So maybe we were a little early, but indeed these things are now gaining currency. The second project we did was a project on managing political disputes. And I want to tell a story from one of those workshops. We gathered leaders from the 2 sides of the Jerusalem community, Palestinian leadership and Israeli leadership. This time not Israelis on the Palestinian side, but outside of Israel proper. We gathered them because there had been a murder within the Israeli side of the divide. And while it was not told, no one discovered exactly who did it, the Jews were sure it was from some Palestinian, from that community. And the rancor and the hurt and the fear between the communities was rising all the time. So we were invited in to gather and then facilitate workshops between the muhtars and the rabbis, between the community heads and the political business leaders on both sides. And we gathered about 15 of them for a year. And we went through this process of the antagonism and the rancor and the hurt and the anger, and then transforming it, making the switch to the storytelling and the resonance and the hopes. And then we began to look for inventions. What are we going to do to sustain this new understanding that each of us have narratives that are valuable, each of us have stories to tell that resonate? What can we do with this to concretize it, to make it absolute? So one thing that the Palestinians were needing was better services from the Jewish municipality. And so together they went to the municipality and they asked for better services, basic services. Very concrete, very basic. The other thing was having to do with the future and the notion of we're going to live together separately but still together in this Jerusalem. Regardless of how the political process works itself out, we're all going to be here. We're not going away. And we accept that, those of us in the room anyway. So what do we do about our populations who are increasingly fearful and separate from each other? What do we do about our youth? They came up with the idea of a playground on the divide. Right on the halfway mark between the two communities, they'd set up a playground. And so they did. And that's one of the things that I talk about in my work. I do work with diplomats, I do work with politicians, but mostly I work with community leaders and youth leaders and the future leaders. And we talk about projects that are big enough to matter, but small enough to work. And if you think about it, a playground on the seam, that's, maybe not so significant. On the other hand, when we're talking about the long future, that's completely significant, because these are the kids who are going to grow up and have memories of playing with the other and being able to encounter the other as a friend, as a playmate. Finally, the last project that we did there was called the Jerusalem Peace Initiative. And this was back in the early 90s, where this time we gathered together political actors, not the highest level leaders, but what we call track 2 actors. Those who have the ear and the trust of the highest political leaders, but also who have connection and relationships with the grassroots. We call them track 2 because they sit between those two levels. So we brought them together, about 15 of them, also for a year, to engage in this same process of dialogue, first antagonism, then resonance, then moving into the invention, and then planning some action. And they came up with 5 different policy plans. They worked in teams, and they worked in plans for how do we live in Jerusalem separately. Right? There's always going to be 2 communities. We don't know what the political solution will be. If it will be one united Jerusalem or a divided Jerusalem or whatever Jerusalem will be, we're always going to be here. And we're always going to need security. How do we cooperate on security regardless of the political outcomes? How do we cooperate on municipal governance? How do we cooperate on economic development? Of course, that's one of the great ideals, is that when peace prevails in that part of the world, tourism will grow exponentially. There will be 1 billion Muslim tourists who will want to visit their holy site in Jerusalem. There will be millions more who don't go to Israel or Palestine for fear of being hurt, or just the psychological fear of being in a war zone. So the notion of economic cooperation around tourism holds a great promise. Okay, so going up the tree. So I spent now about 7 years in Jerusalem, first doing my dissertation, then running these workshops. And at this point, I was invited to come back to America and to help run a peace and conflict studies program at Haverford and Bryn Mawr College. And getting the distance from the conflict and now in this very pleasant pastoral setting, I was actually invited at that point from a distance to go watch President Arafat and President Yitzhak Rabin sign their agreement at the White House. This great moment of accomplishment, this great time in which, yes, peace looks like it's possible. And I was invited not because I'd had so much large-level, high-level impact, but rather because I'd been involved at the grassroots level, at helping to prepare the ground to make dialogue more normal, to make the notion that it's possible to talk about peace between peoples at the track of communities, at the track of community-level leaders, and even at the level of those people who have influence and access to political leaders. So watching them shake hands, watching them fulfill this notion that peace is possible, I then crowed in an article that I wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer the next day saying peace is possible and conflict resolution has made a difference. I got a phone call from a head of a foundation saying, wow, you just said that peace is possible and that conflict resolution made a difference, that you helped to contribute to this Oslo process that led to the handshake. My foundation has just spent $20 million on conflict resolution in the former Soviet Union. Can you prove to my board that we've succeeded? So we studied their project proposals, and we called him a few weeks later, and we said, Steve, he was the program officer, we have some bad news and some good news. What do you want to hear first? He said, well, let's get the bad news over first. He said, the bad news is that these project proposals don't have a very good theory of success. It's not very nuanced. I mean, if I was your board member, I would be holding you to conflict resolution, because that's what it's called. But there's no resolution here. So we have a big problem in our field, because if the highest goal here is also the first goal, we're often not going to make it. And if that's the only thing we're holding out, we're actually going to fail much, much more often, perhaps almost always. Whew, he said, that's bad news. What's the good news? The good news is if you'll give us a grant, we'll go study what our field has said in more nuanced ways. And what our field has said is actually we have to be specific and nuanced about what success means by asking everybody in intervention in a participatory way, what does success mean to you? When we're going to intervene in your conflict within Jerusalem, in Northern Ireland, in Cincinnati, in Winnipeg, between any level of group, what is it that's most important to the participants? What do they see as the outcome of this effort? How do we get the participants? How do we get the interveners? How do we get the funders? How do we get as many stakeholders as possible together to define success? Not the grand success, but the steps to success, the pieces of peace. If we can do that, we can begin also to design in a participatory way, a way that gives everybody agency for articulating what should be done and how to do it, and most importantly, why it matters. So this became my next path, actually. And that's what I've been working on now for the last 20 years, and Stephanie did her thesis on it, which is a process of fostering identity-based cooperation, identity across the various stakeholding groups. Again, whether they're youth and teachers, whether they're Jews and Arabs, whether they're natives and nationals, I don't know what the distinctions are. Basically, everybody articulates, this is what's important to me and this is why. And then together we build an agenda. And so then the conflict resolver, the facilitator, is not much more than that, a convener helping people be clear about their purposes and their practices. How are we doing for time? Good. Okay, so as we develop this methodology, it's actually called action evaluation. And the notion is that we are actively evaluating success as we're pursuing it. Not the evaluation that we get to the end and say, how did we do? And usually not so well. But rather the success that evolves out of the dialogue and discourse among people who together are defining what it is they're trying to accomplish, whether small or big. Whether those diplomats who are setting the agenda for the dialogue in the Middle East, or whether those children and educators who are setting the dialogue for the classroom. Right? So we're developing this approach, and we used it in various different settings in the United States. We went up and down the East Coast in the United States with fishermen, with government regulators, and with environmentalists. 3 very strong identity groups, usually having nothing good to say to each other. And we had each of them say, how do we maintain this discipline, this industry? We're all losing, we're losing. The fishermen are losing, the environmentalists are losing, the regulators are losing, because we're in competition with each other. How do we define what it is that each of us needs, each of us pursues in ways that can incorporate the other? We worked with medical centers. For some reason, there seems to be a lot of conflict within medicine. We worked with the doctors, we worked with the board members, we worked with the patients. Again, how do we articulate together what a collaborative future would look like. Worked with business leaders, business participants, and then our largest project was in 2001. After working actually with a project with youth in a foster care agency, when we did the same process. It was actually a very simple process, but it was surprisingly transformative. This was a foster care agency called Berkshire Farms Institute, the largest foster care agency in New York State. And they were developing an innovative project to help students in the foster care agency transition out into independence. Very treacherous time. They didn't have parents or family structures, and they had to now be independent because they were maxing out of the system. And what we said to them is, let's ask the students what they need. And the leaders of the institute said, they don't really know what they need. We have to develop a program to help them. We said, let's try. Let's ask them. And lo and behold, when they shared their goals, when they articulated why these goals were important to them, the staff said, amazing. Not only do they know what they need, we didn't realize that that's what they needed. And so together they developed a new agenda. This approach, working from the bottom up, from the inside out, gained some traction. And after the riot in Cincinnati, a federal judge heard about the work, and she asked if this approach could work to deal with this conflict between police and community. She had been a former domestic relations attorney, and she understood that a riot, in particular its trigger, which was the killing of a young African-American male, and the riot, which had also been an expression of distress about what had been seen as patterns of police misuse of force and racial profiling, that such a conflict doesn't really start its ending at the courtroom. It ends its ending if we can get to a different attitude, if we can get to a different understanding of what the narratives are, what the needs are. Then perhaps we indeed can build a new agenda for the future that the court can help to ratify and move forward. So we took this methodology really having its roots in Jerusalem, really having its roots in the story between Mohammed and Ifrat, really having its roots to some extent in my own experience as a second grader, inviting everyone in to have a conversation. And we invited people, we ended up getting 3,500 citizens, and we broke them into different identity groups, youth groups, African American citizens, political leaders, business leaders, white citizens, 8 different communities, each of them saying, when we think about our future, we think about what police-community relations could look like in the future here, this is what we want. This is why we want it. We've started now trying to organize and understand how people tell stories. And how they tell stories, we're beginning to understand, fits into what we think is a process of transition, a process from individualism, this is who I am, and this is how my story is told, to collectivism, this is how my story makes sense to me, is expressed by, is supported within the context of the group that I'm part of. It gets its agency, it gets its strength, it even gets its voice oftentimes from the fact that I am part of a group. I am somebody because I'm part of a group. And then finally, at the highest level of this global citizenship, stories are told in a collective sense. This is who I am as part of a larger group. And I want to share a couple of these stories with you. So again, how this process works is we invite people to share, this is what I want, this is why I want it. And we ask them within the group context. So the youth sit with other youth, the black citizens sit with other black citizens, the police officers sit with other police officers. And they tell their why stories. We invite them to talk about why they care in terms of experiences. And here's an example of this first level of stories that we're beginning to monitor, we're beginning to code actually, to try to understand how people tell stories and how stories evolve. So here's a story by a young African-American male. We call this a story of individual. I'm a God-fearing man trying to get closer to God. I was raised in a family where we functioned together and had good communication. I learned that communication is very important. Me and God, me and you, me and a police officer. We need to communicate with each other. So this individual story is a grounding. It's a first step. And it grows. It begins to grow to a group level story, a story in which, my stories are out of order, sorry. Oops. Here it is. Okay, the story of the group. So here's an example of a story where someone says, who I am is part of my larger context, not the whole context, but this group that makes me have meaning. It gives me a sense of power and agency. I think Cincinnati is a great city that has a problem of racial tension that needs to be resolved. I also care about progress in the African American population's social and economic position in this city. Both the racial tension and the position of the African American community add fuel to the issue at hand. So the way I see myself, the way I organize what's important to me has to do with my group, the collectivity that in this case is at threat and that needs to help to be part of this change that will conclude us. And then finally, the level of storytelling that we hear, that we're monitoring, is this one that gets beyond the I, beyond the us, finally to the we. The we in which our intergroup identity, the identity which says, I'm an individual, I'm part of a group, and then finally, I'm part of a group of groups. When we were younger, all the neighborhood kids played in our backyard. We had friends of all races, we all went to school together, but once we started getting older and going to different schools, we just don't get together anymore. It seems like two worlds. I miss our old one. And so too those Palestinian and Israeli youth who play in the playground or played in the playground. I'm not sure it exists anymore, actually. They'll miss that, I hope. They'll miss that the past was one in which they played with others from other nations. They'll remember there was a time when they had trust with the other. And what we need to be able to build when we get people through this process is, yes, my own individual identity is my root. My collective identity is my core. But my larger identity, my global citizenship, is my future, is the hope. And this process of moving people from antagonism to resonance, from individual to collective, is a journey. It's a long one. It's not one that leads to this great success, but it's one that hopefully, not only hopefully, that indeed actually, we've seen it over and over, leads people to be able to say, there is a hope out there. I'm part of that process. It's possible to build. I've been able to come a full circle to some extent with being back in Israel now. I've been back there since October. As Stephanie talked about, I'm now back to Israel as a professor, actually the first full-time professor in conflict resolution in Israel. Every university has a conflict resolution program, but I'm the only professor who's full-time in the program. For me, that's a full circle, because as I joined this first program in Virginia, of this first idea that conflict resolution can be a field, since then I believe that it's a separate field. It's not only a derivative. It's not only a derivative of all the other disciplines, but to some extent, it's the elephant on which all the disciplines have a hand. Right? The sociologists say it's this, the psychologists say it's this, the political scientists say it's this, but we say it's this. And therefore, being able to build a field that has its own discipline, its own methodology, its own evaluation system, that's a full circle for me. But more than that, it's also the sense that I'm building the future playground. This time not for the youth, not for the elementary school children, but for the graduate students, the ones who indeed are going to take up leadership, the Israeli Jewish and Israeli Palestinian citizens who come and study at our university, who indeed will be creating a future that can live with each other, that can be sustained through each other, with each other. And we did the same process that I've been talking about, the same process of getting everybody to say, here's what's important to us and here's why it matters, this time about our program. So the program is about 13 years old, but it's never asked all the participants in it, what should it be? How does this program unfold to fulfill and meet their narratives? And so we've been doing that. The full circle, coming back to the notion of participation and agency, moving from vision to program, how do we think about a program and institutionalize it? And this is how we've done, oops, I'm going to skip over this. This is how we've done it. You know, as you can see to some extent, we asked various representatives of the various groups that make up our program, our conflict resolution program, to tell us what should this program be about? Why do they care about it, and how could it be created? So we had a core group of organizers, myself and 2 colleagues. We had half of our faculty, most all of whom are not in the program, but associated with it. About a quarter of our current students, and then a small number of our large alumni network to tell us about their what, whys, and hows. And then we reached at a consensus agreement. After each group reaches its own agreement, then representatives come together and they reach this intergroup, group of group agreement. I'm happy that one of the goals, and I certainly had my influence on it, but it's a consensus process. So if all the representatives don't agree, it doesn't get accepted. But indeed, one of our goals is that it'll be developing a distinctive niche for the program focusing on identity. And indeed, I'd rather be known as Mr. Identity than Mr. Antagonism. And that's the real contribution that I believe I bring to this field, is that if we are able to mine and pay very careful attention to identities as they're articulated, at the individual level, at the group level, and then finally and ideally at the intergroup level, we'll be able to mine the antagonism of a conflict and foster the resonance of cooperation in very systematic and structured ways. I have to say, one of the joyful pains of this field is that when we're actually able to bring people together to do this work, it works. It works. It's systematic, it's step by step, and getting people to make that switch actually isn't that hard. Getting them in the room, keeping them in the room, sometimes that's the hardest work. But then once we can, the worst of problems begin to be sometimes the best of possibilities. So, when we ask them why, these are the sorts of, we call them passion points, that they tell us what matters for them. They want to have influence. This is why this program matters to them. They want to be productive. They want to create greater integration. And this is about the future of their program. Here's the why, the underlying taproot. And the what's, as you saw before, providing our students with theoretical knowledge and practical skills. And how? How are we going to do it? By applying it in our professional life. What's our goal? To build an interdisciplinary community. How are we going to do it? To foster awareness and development, and so forth. So from the taproot of the deepest goals, deepest values, for me again, participation and agency, for them, here are the different words that anchor what they're passionately concerned about. We then get the branches that begin to create the particular goals and ideals for creating this cooperation into the future, and then the specific steps that are big enough to matter but small enough to work. So from confrontation, in this case, rather, from cooperation to implementation. That's how this cycle works. So speaking of the full circle, just before I took off for Israel, I was giving a lecture in my hometown of Yellow Springs, Ohio, where I went to that wonderful school where my teacher, Bev, gave me a sense of participation and agency. And I told that story in her presence, now 85 years old. And after my speech, I went up to her and I said, "So Bev, how was it? How did I do?" She said, "Jay, you know." So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to dialogue with you after we hear from Hamdassa and Stephanie about their responses. Thank you.
I would like to invite Dr. Hamdassa Tussaud, who was our distinguished visiting ESOL professor in 2006 and 2007, and is now teaching in the Peace and Conflict Studies program at the Arthur Morrill Center for Peace and Justice at the University of Manitoba, to take a few minutes to respond to Jay's talk.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm older than both of these. So, where I come from, if you are an older person in the group, you have some advantage. So I have this advantage of calling them by their names if they don't want.
Please.
First names. Before I make my comments, I want to make 3 points. One is it was my privilege. I spent one academic year at Menno College, 2006-2007. it was a wonderful experience. I want to say to the representatives of CMU and also University of Winnipeg that Menno Simon's College program in conflict resolution is one of the best. Excellent faculty, excellent curriculum, very solid. When I got there, I didn't know, to be honest, I didn't know very much about Mennonite, except at the University of Waterloo, I had some interaction with them. I was visiting for the conferences for a year or so. But I was not sure about a dominationally based academic program. So, but they didn't preach about Mennonite theology. They focused on the field itself, and it was excellent program. Second is about Jay. I knew about Jay before I met him. Someone told me that Jay was one of the first American Jews who went to Israel and worked with Palestinians, said we should start dialogue. That's the way I knew Jay. Then I met him at Antioch. Then a comment about Stephanie. You know, if you are a teacher, you live long enough, and you are lucky you live long enough, you may come across some students who surpass you. Mm-hmm. And she's one of those. She's totally and this is an excellent lecture, so I don't want to add anything to that. I just want, last night we met in their house, and so we discussed what do we do, how we want to do. So one of the suggestions that Jay made was speak your own experience, our own experience, how we came to the field, what identity means to us. So that's how we're going to start. First, identity is very important. My first identity-based conflict was in grade 5. Mm-hmm. In rural South in Ethiopia, in Seventh-day Adventist school. And I'm first generation literate, come from countryside, never been in a city, and I love the school. In my family, I have 2 older brothers. They were old enough to work on the farm, and then I have younger siblings, and I was this restless kid in between. So that's how they sent me to school, and I love the school. So I was doing very well. And then in grade 5, I had a teacher, a wonderful teacher actually. He is from the north, and in Ethiopia, we also, like in the Middle East, the north and the south, and history of conflicts, domination. So this gentleman from the north in Amhara, so he wanted us to succeed local kids, and he was talking. One day he got carried away. He said, "Hamdesa," he said, "Yeah, we want to change your name. We need to change your name." He said, I didn't know what to say, You change my name? I mean, why you want to change my name for? He said in Amharic, "Simet Aisatim," which means it does not make sense. Mm-hmm. My parents gave to me in our language, it means to be thankful. Mm-hmm. To them, it makes sense. I mean, why are you saying this? What kind of name you want to give me? I asked him. I don't even know why I got threatened. I was half crying. This is the biggest challenge I have ever faced in my life. If somebody changed my name in school, I was going to go home and tell my parents I have a new name. So I asked him, what kind of name do you want to give me? He said, Amdesa. It means, so it's a 2 words. Amde means in Amharic, it's a pillar. Okay, vertical, horizontal, vertical. Then Esa means is mine. So in Amharic, it will be my pillar. That's a culture that emphasizes hierarchy. Christian Orthodox, much more connected to the Middle East, whereas where I come from, a kind of more horizontal pastoralists, in the typical African, connected to nature. So when they give me my name, the story is that as I was to be born, and then they lost their cattle. Some disease came, they lost their cattle, and then the child before me died. So the family was in terrible shock, and they didn't know what to expect. So this baby comes along. The story is my father on that day somehow ran around frantically, and somehow he found a cow with milk, and he brought the cow home. They fed the child milk, and then the family said, in Oromo tradition, well, we lost other child, and we lost our cattle, but now we have a new baby. He seems to be healthy. We have milk for him, so let's be thankful. In Oromo culture, after you eat, you give hamda, which means thankful. That's how my name is. So then finally I said to the teacher, you are not going to change my name. So I cried and jumped out of school, out of class. So that was my first identity crisis. And then my first, at George Mason University also, he and I, we didn't know each other. We arrived at the same time. I came there, I became international student advisor. It's a emerging school. Virginia, if you know anything about history, in US history, Virginia is very conservative, a lot of stuff about slavery and all of that. And all of a sudden you have got this school at the border of Washington, D.C. You have got the urbanite and the rural kind of having schism. And then my school, I arrived at the school, there was a huge crisis. The International Club, the association with the burnt carpets, there was International Week. The Arabs said, the Israelis, the Jews got better speakers, and vice versa. So my boss called me in, and she said, you are the new international advisor, I want you to fix this. Franz Pruitt, a wonderful person. So that was my first resolution effort. Now, here is also how I met George, what's his name, John Burton. I had a GA, graduate assistant, by name of Charles Barringer. Do you remember him? Oh, sure. Barringer? He was working for him. So he used to come and brag to me about this new master's program in conflict resolution. And he was talking, his father was the co-director, so he would talk to me. One day I got pissed off. Generally, I'm a very mild person. Once in a while, I go, so I said, Charles, come on, what do these guys, this bunch of white guys, they know about conflict resolution? The way back home my people do is, when there's a conflict, elders come out on the tree, they sit there and the conflict is resolved. They sit there for days, 30 days, so on and so forth. So what do you guys know about this? And then I still remember very vividly the first time they invited John Burton, he was at the University of Maryland. Mm-hmm. So he said, Dr. Tuso, he said, you come with me. This is our guru. You have to come and listen to his lecture. So I went with him. And then John Burton joined the program, and then he heard about my complaints. So one day he invited me, he said, I understand you have some concerns about our program. Why don't you read our literature? Why don't you teach some courses? Maybe we can have some understanding. So that's how I started it. Identity matters. My experience, in addition to where I grew up, is also working with the wretched of the earth, the refugees, people who have been chased out of their home, people who have been brutalized in camps. And it is interesting, but also very difficult to work with. They bring identity conflict from back home. They also have identity conflict here in North America. Another big conflict is some of them bring young children here, or they get children here. The children grow up not speaking the language of the parents. You talk about identity conflict. When I was here at Menno College, I was working with the Oromo group. Oromos are a group I come from, about some 40 million in the Horn of Africa. Nobody knows about them. So these are the lost people. And so I was working with a family. And one day, this gentleman called me. He told me, hey, Dr. Tuso, I'm a child, and I've got this young boy. I told teach him about Oromia. One day the young kid tells me, I'm a Canadian, leave me alone. I don't know you're Oromia. So you have conflict, identity conflict in the same family. So identity matters. It's a very, very important issue. Now, I have to confront as an African what's going on in Africa. The new Cold War, two wars. War on terrorism, war on the infidel. The narrative goes this way. If you want democracy, you should support us against the terrorists. This is what Africans have been told. The other side says, if you are a good Muslim, you have to help us to fight against the infidel. Historically, the African managed to absorb all these identities. In the same family, it is conceivable to have a Christian clergy and a Muslim clergy, and then other members who don't believe in any of these religions, they go along, they get along. If it's a Christian holiday, they go there. If it's an Islamic holiday, they go there. If it's African tradition, all of them go there. That's the way I grew up. Okay? One writer said, I wrote an article about this recently. One writer said, an African writer said, the Africans managed to have these different ideas in the same soul. Now, the Africans be told, you cannot have that anymore. You either be this, or you are no more a good this. And so this is the conflict I have to deal with. And 2007, Jessica is here. I was lucky. Yes, she is. Yes. I was privileged. They invited me to give a speech there, and I gave a presentation on the topic of the new Cold War in the African predicament. This is the stuff I have to deal with. And the final comment for me is also the manipulation of identity by the powerfuls. The case of Somalia. Somalia in African states is unique. One religion, one ethnic group, one language. No other African state has that kind of characteristics. Struggle of power. I follow the Horn of Africa journal. I am associate editor, so I follow with Somalis and all of that. And they fought over power. Then they divide people along clan lines, sub-clan lines. Then the whole state sunk. I have been working for 30 years with Oromo community in diaspora. We are experiencing the same type of phenomena now. So identity matters, and there is more to be studied. People like Jay, they pioneered. It's a wonderful work, and there is more to be done. And therefore, I conclude my comments here.
Well, it's a great privilege for me to be here on this panel with two great scholars and mentors in our field of conflict resolution. And over the last couple of days, we've been talking about this presentation, and I will go along the lines of the narratives that Dr. Rothman and Dr. Senahi and others in our field are looking at as a way to move towards peace building. And so I will share a little bit of my own story. And so for some of you who don't know me, I am a refugee from war. I escaped from Laos at the end of the Laos Secret War, the Vietnam War. And in the period between 1960 and 1975, the country of Laos gained the distinction of being subjected to some of the heaviest aerial bombardment in the history of warfare. United States aircraft dropped almost 2.1 million tons of bombs on Laos, an area slightly larger than Utah or smaller than Labrador, an amount approximately equals to the total tonnage dropped by the United States Air Forces during all of World War II in both the European and Pacific theaters. They say had the bombings been spread out throughout the country, there would have been almost 9 tons of bombs per square kilometer. So by the end of the war, Laos has become the most heavily bombed country per capita in the history of the world and continues to be severely contaminated with unexploded ordnance. I still remember the beauty of the land and the people I grew up with as a child and have spent time with as an adult. These people are caring, gentle, and peace-loving. Their genuine smiles, life stories, and ready acceptance of others are etched in my memory. I have always been drawn back emotionally and intellectually to the complexity of my birthplace, a place where community, inclusivity, peace, and harmony in relationships are highly valued, but at the same time, a place that has witnessed some of the most brutal forms of violence. There is no better experience of this contrast than to take an early morning walk to the temple on top of Mount Pusi, quietly and elegantly presiding over the slumbering streets of Luang Prabang, only to be reminded of the dark side of Laos by the presence of a rusty old anti-aircraft gun just 10 steps from the temple foundations. The streets of Luang Prabang are full of sights, smells, and sounds of Laos, monks dressed in their orange garments, the smell of food over the open ovens, the elegance of elders watching over the streets, children laughing, and beautiful flowers and plants adorning the shops, planted in old missile casings. This image defines the heart of conflict resolution, namely taking the very instrument of destruction and turning it into a foundation for beauty, growth, and new life. These images, metaphors for conflict resolution, abound in Laos. There is no question that peace has existed in Laos for thousands of years, and violence has also existed in Laos for thousands of years. What I find so incredibly interesting about Laos is that peace seems to find its way back to the people of Laos rather quickly, in spite of the exploitation that foreign powers occasionally exercise to polarize different ethnic groups. I believe that one of the reasons this is that the grassroots Lao people have, over time, developed conflict resolution systems that provide an outlet for conflict situations and allow for a rebuilding of relationships within and between ethnic groups. They have done this by using very elaborate systems of mediation and rebuilding rituals and ceremonies that give them common ground in which to get to know each other. So you, Jay, and I speak, very similarly about culture building, taking an individual culture A and individual culture B, and through this interaction, they create this culture C. And so the individual cultures still exist and predominate, but the ground for peace is found in the behavioral expectations created by the collective culture. So as you state in your paper, through language and interaction, we create and recreate each other and ourselves by telling stories about who we are and what matters to us. A very complete picture of this is evident between the many cultural ethnicities in Laos. Similarly to the Middle East, the people of Southeast Asia have also endured violence, genocide, and brutality. Both groups have had a long history of interaction in their respective geographical places for thousands of years.